The river no longer guided us as it had earlier in the morning. Its influence diminished gradually, giving way to a broader movement beneath the hull that carried a different weight and rhythm. The change required no adjustment. It announced itself clearly enough through motion alone. I remained at my position, watching the water where it met the vessel's side. The patterns there are often more instructive than any distant view. The flow had steadied, and the sound it produced had taken on a depth that suggested open water was close at hand. The sky showed no sign of alteration. The cloud cover held firm, even and unbroken, as though set in place deliberately. I acknowledged it and returned to my notes. There was nothing to be gained by revisiting the matter. I marked the next turning of the glass and carried forward the estimates already made. The figures agreed with one another closely enough. When that is the case, it is best to allow them to stand. On an earlier voyage, one that remained within the western reaches of the Mediterranean, I had encountered a similar stretch of grey sky that persisted far longer than expected. At the time, I remember feeling a subtle impatience, though there was no reason for it. The vessel had continued as she should, and the sea had offered no objection. That impatience did not return on later journeys. The banks were now distant enough that their presence was felt only in the way the air moved. The smell of the river had thinned, replaced by something cleaner and less distinct. I took note of it without assigning it importance. Such changes occur whether one observes them or not. The captain spoke briefly with one of the crew, then moved on. The vessel's routine had settled into a comfortable pattern, each man attending to his work without need for instruction. I have always found this stage of departure to be the most agreeable. The demands are light, and the work requires only attention. I checked the compass again and confirmed our heading. The needle remained faithful to its task, offering the same reading it had given before. There was no reason to question it. Instruments, like people, perform best when they are trusted. The water beneath us lifted the hull a little more distinctly now, the motion spreading through the vessel in a slow and even way. It was not yet a true swell, but it carried the promise of one. I adjusted my sense of speed accordingly, though the figures themselves required no revision. When I first began this work, I often struggled during such transitions. The shift from inland water to open sea can be subtle, and it is easy to overcorrect in response to it. Experience tempers that impulse. One learns to let the vessel speak first. The sky remained unchanged as the afternoon advanced. I noted the consistency of the light, which neither brightened nor dimmed in any significant way. It is during such hours that one becomes aware of how little the work depends on spectacle. I reviewed the day's progress, once more, not because it demanded revision, but because the act itself reinforces order. The distance covered, the time passed, the course held. All were in agreement. I set the notes aside and allowed them to stand. The sound along the hull deepened further, steady and unbroken. It is a sound that carries easily through thought, asking nothing in return. I have often found that it marks the passage of time more effectively than the glass. I recalled another short journey, made years earlier between familiar ports, when I had first begun to rely on estimation rather than constant measurement. That passage had taught me the value of restraint. Too much attention can be as disruptive as too little. The river's final influence faded without ceremony. There was no clear boundary to mark the moment, only a gradual easing of one condition and the acceptance of another. The vessel responded as she should, settling into the broader movement beneath her. I made a note of the change and allowed the matter to rest. The course remained true. The wind held its quarter. The sky offered nothing new. As evening approached, the light softened slightly, though the cloud cover did not break. I adjusted my expectations accordingly and prepared for the hours ahead. There would be time enough later for further observation. For now, the work required only steadiness. I turned the glass once more, recorded the hour, and returned it to its place. The vessel continued on, carrying us quietly beyond the reach of the river and into the water that lay waiting beyond. The movement beneath the hull settled into a steadier rhythm as the last influence of the river eased away. There was no moment that marked the change clearly, only a gradual release, as though one current had loosened its grip and another had taken its place. The vessel responded without hesitation, accepting the broader water beneath her as readily as she had accepted the narrower channel before. I remained at my post, watching the water where it passed along the hull. The patterns there spoke plainly enough. The flow had evened out, and the sound it carried had deepened into something more uniform. It was the sound of distance, not yet fully realized, but no longer postponed. The sky remained unchanged. The cloud cover held steady, low and even, allowing no edge of light to sharpen or fade. I acknowledged it as I had all morning and made no further note. Some conditions require attention. Others require only acceptance. I turned the glass and marked the hour. The sand moved as it should, settling without pause. I found comfort in that regularity. Time measured in this way does not hurry. It passes at the pace it chooses, indifferent to expectation. The tide had slackened further now, its earlier assistance replaced by a more neutral presence. I adjusted my estimates to reflect the change, though the numbers themselves shifted very little. The vessel's pace remained even. When adjustments are small, it is often best to leave them that way. On earlier voyages, when my work kept me close to shore, I had often mistaken the tide's influence for something more complex. It took several passages before I learned how easily one can attribute intention to water that is merely moving as it always has. That lesson returned to me now, quietly, without need for repetition. The air carried less of the river's scent as we progressed. What remained was faint and indistinct, and neither pleasant nor unpleasant, simply present. I noted it without assigning it meaning. Smells, like sounds, change whether one attends to them or not. The crew moved about their work with little conversation. Each man knew his place, and the vessel responded accordingly. I have always preferred departures that unfold in this manner. When routine asserts itself early, it tends to hold. I checked the compass again, not because it demanded confirmation, but because the act itself reinforces order. The needle remained steady, showing the same reading it had given before. I accepted it and moved on. The water's motion became more pronounced beneath us, though still gentle. The hull lifted and settled in a slow, even cadence that required no adjustment. It was not yet the swell of open ocean, but it carried its suggestion clearly enough. I recalled a shorter passage made years earlier along the southern coast, when I had first begun to trust dead reckoning over constant reference to land. That voyage had been unremarkable in every sense, yet it taught me more than many longer ones. Progress measured without sight has a way of clarifying thought. The sky showed no sign of yielding as the day continued. I made no effort to anticipate its change. Experience has taught me that anticipation invites distraction. It is better to proceed as conditions allow and to accept what presents itself. I reviewed the distance covered since the morning and compared it to the time past. The figures agreed closely enough. When such agreement occurs, there is little to be gained by pressing further. I set the matter aside. The sound of water along the hull remained constant, its tone unbroken. At first it drew the ear. Later it receded into the background, becoming part of the vessel itself. This is how most useful sounds behave. They announce themselves, then fade into function. On one of my earliest voyages, I remember struggling to ignore such sounds, attending to each change as though it carried instruction. It took time to learn that constancy is itself a form of guidance. The captain passed nearby once more, his attention directed ahead. We exchanged no words. There was nothing that required them. The vessel's motion spoke plainly enough. As the afternoon wore on, the light altered slightly, though the cloud cover remained intact. The change was subtle, more a softening than a shift. I noted it without expectation. Light, like water, moves according to its own rules. I turned the glass again and marked the hour. The act required no thought. My hand moved as it always had, and I allowed it to do so without interruption. The tide's influence was now fully spent. What remained was the broader movement of the water beyond the river's reach. The vessel accepted it without hesitation, settling into a rhythm that promised continuity rather than change. I made a note of the transition and allowed it to stand. There was nothing to resolve. The course held. The pace remained even. The sky offered nothing new. In earlier years, such moments would have invited reflection. I have since learned that reflection is best reserved for times when it is required. Routine sustains itself most effectively when left undisturbed. The water beneath us carried the vessel forward steadily, its motion unbroken. I returned my attention to the compass once more, confirmed what I already knew, and let the matter rest. The hours passed without insistence. Each was marked, recorded, and released in turn. It is in such passage that confidence is built, not through assertion, but through repetition. I turned the glass again, made my note, and allowed the vessel to continue on her way, carrying us quietly beyond the last influence of the river and into the broader water that lay ahead. The movement beneath the hull grew broader as the last traces of the river's influence faded entirely. The water carried a different weight now, its motion slower to change and more deliberate in its direction. The vessel responded without hesitation, settling into a rhythm that required no correction. I remained attentive to the sound along the hull. It had deepened further, losing the softer character of inland water and taking on a steadier tone. This was the sound of distance, beginning its work, though distance itself remained only a measure. not yet a presence. The sky remained closed. The cloud cover showed no thinning at the edges, no softening of its uniformity. I noted the persistence of it and allowed the matter to rest. Such skies are not uncommon near the coast in early spring, and they often linger longer than one expects. I turned the glass and marked the hour. The sand moved evenly, without pause or hesitation. I have always trusted the glass more than the sky. One measures time, the other merely suggests it. The vessel's pace held steady as the water widened around us. The wind remained light, pressing the sails just enough to keep her moving without strain. I confirmed the heading once more against the compass. The needle held its line, offering no reason for concern. In earlier years, when I first began venturing beyond familiar waters, I would often look for signs of open sea, as though they might announce themselves clearly. I have since learned that such transitions rarely declare their arrival. They occur gradually, revealing themselves only through consistency. The air carried less warmth than it had closer to shore, though the change was subtle. I noted it more by habit than necessity. Air, like water, shifts without asking to be observed. I reviewed the distance covered since our last record and compared it to the time past. The figures agreed within the bounds I had expected. When such agreement occurs, it is best not to disturb it with unnecessary revision. The sky offered no opportunity for observation. I did not wait upon it. Dead reckoning served as it always had, drawing on course, speed, and time rather than light. I have found this method most reliable when conditions remain unchanged. On one of my earliest crossings, made not far from these same waters, I recall feeling unsettled by the absence of the sun for several days. At the time, I believed the difficulty lay in the method itself. It was only later that I understood the difficulty lay in my impatience. The vessel continued on her course, without variation. The water beneath her carried the motion forward evenly, lifting and settling the hull in a slow cadence that invited no intervention. I adjusted nothing and allowed the rhythm to establish itself. The crew moved quietly about their work. There was little conversation, and none was required. Each man attended to his task, as though the vessel itself had dictated the order of things. I have always found this stage of a voyage to be the most agreeable. I turned the glass again and marked the hour. The act required no thought. My hand moved as it always had, guided by repetition rather than intention. The sky remained unchanged as the afternoon advanced. The light softened slightly, though no break appeared in the cloud cover. I made no effort to anticipate a clearing. Experience has taught me that anticipation serves no practical purpose. The water's motion remained steady, its direction unambiguous. I confirmed the course once more and allowed the matter to rest. There was no disagreement between the compass, the vessel's movement, and the time recorded. I recalled a shorter passage made years earlier, when I had relied too heavily on the promise of a noon sight that never came. That day had taught me the value of proceeding without expectation. Progress measured by routine often proves more reliable than progress measured by hope. The sound along the hull continued unbroken. At times, it drew the ear. At others, it faded entirely into the background. I have learned to trust both responses equally. I made another note, carrying forward the estimates already established. The figures required no adjustment. When numbers agree, it is best to let them remain so. The horizon, such as it could be discerned beneath the cloud cover, showed no variation. Sea and sky met without distinction, their boundary softened by the even light. I noted the lack of definition and moved on. On earlier voyages, this absence would have unsettled me. I would have sought contrast where none existed, inventing reference where none was required. Experience has a way of quieting such habits. The vessel's motion remained unchanged as the day continued. The wind held its quarter. The sails answered it without complaint. I observed the agreement and allowed it to continue. I turned the glass once more and marked the hour. The passage of time announced itself only through repetition. There were no events to divide it, no moments that demanded attention. The sky offered nothing new. I did not press it for answers. The work continued as it always had, guided by measure rather than sight. As the light shifted toward evening, the air cooled slightly. The change was gradual, noticed only because I had learned to expect it. I noted it and returned my attention to the vessel's movement. The water beneath us carried the hull forward steadily, its motion broad and unbroken. I confirmed the course again, accepted the reading, and set the matter aside. There was nothing to resolve. The estimates held. The method remained sound. The vessel continued on her way, carrying us quietly farther from the last certainty of land and deeper into the routine of open water. I turned the glass, made my note, and allowed the hours to pass as they would, each one marked, recorded, and released in turn. The water beneath the hull carried a broader motion now, one that did not yield quickly to small changes. The vessel answered it with a steadiness that felt earned rather than imposed. I observed the movement without expectation and allowed it to continue. The sound along the hull had settled into a deeper register, its rhythm slower and more even than before. It was no longer shaped by banks or channels. Instead, it reflected the larger body of water that now held us. I found that the ear adjusts to such changes more readily than the eye. The sky remained closed, its surface unbroken and without feature. The light that filtered through it was even and diffuse, offering no sharpness by which to judge time. I noted the consistency and turned my attention elsewhere. I reviewed the course we had been holding and compared it to the vessel's motion. There was no divergence worth remarking upon. When movement and measure align quietly, there is little reason to interfere. The wind continued from its earlier quarter, unchanged in strength. The sails answered it without strain, and the hull carried forward as she had since leaving the river's reach. I allowed the arrangement to stand. On earlier coastal passages, I would often look for the moment when the sea first asserted itself, as though it might announce its presence clearly. I have since learned that the sea does not require acknowledgement. It makes itself known through persistence, not display. I returned to my notes and extended the record forward, carrying with it the assumptions already made. Dead reckoning, when practiced with patience, gains strength through continuity. Each estimate supports the next, provided one resists the urge to revise without cause. The crew remained settled into their work, their movements steady and unhurried. There was no sense of departure now, only continuation. I have always found this transition reassuring. When a voyage ceases to feel like a beginning, it often proceeds more smoothly. The air carried a faint coolness that lingered without shifting. I noticed it less with each passing hour until it became part of the background rather than a feature. Such changes tend to matter less once they stop announcing themselves. I glanced again at the compass and found the needle where I expected it to be. Its steadiness required no further comment. Instruments that behave predictably earn trust through repetition. Time passed without punctuation. I noted its passage through habit rather than attention, letting the routine carry the record forward. The work did not demand focus so much as presence. The water's motion remained unchanged, lifting and settling the hull in a slow cadence that invited no correction. I adjusted nothing and allowed the vessel to maintain her course. I recalled a passage made years earlier, when I had first begun to rely on extended dead reckoning rather than frequent reference to land or sky. That voyage had taught me the value of restraint. Adjustments made too often tend to introduce more error than they resolve. The sky offered no opportunity for observation. I did not regard this as a limitation. The method at hand was sufficient, and sufficiency is often preferable to precision when conditions remain stable. I extended the estimates once more, carrying them forward through the hours already past. The figures required no amendment. Their agreement was quiet and unremarkable, which is how such agreement is best encountered. The horizon remained indistinct beneath the cloud cover. Its boundaries softened until sea and sky appeared to share the same tone. I noted the lack of contrast and allowed my attention to return to the vessel's movement. The sound along the hull continued without interruption. At times, it receded entirely from awareness. At others, it returned gently, reminding me of the water's presence without insisting upon it. The wind held steady as the light shifted toward evening. The change was gradual, marked more by temperature than by sight. I recorded the transition and moved on. There was nothing in the arrangement of sea, wind, or vessel that suggested the need for change. I accepted this and allowed the hours to continue unfolding as they had before. The record advanced without complication. Each entry followed the last, not as a progression, but as a continuation. This is how most useful work proceeds, without emphasis and without pause. The vessel carried on, her motion broad and unbroken, drawing us farther into the routine of open water. I remained with the work, attentive but unhurried, and let the evening settle in as it chose. The light diminished gradually as evening settled over the water, though the sky itself showed little change. The cloud cover remained intact, its tone darkening only by degree rather than by shift. I noted the loss of daylight, more by temperature than by sight. The water beneath the hull carried a broader motion now, one that lifted and settled the vessel with greater regularity. It was not forceful, but it was persistent. I adjusted my sense of time to match it, and allowed the rhythm to establish itself. As the first night watch took its place, the vessel's sounds became more pronounced. The movement of water along the hull deepened, and the creak of lines under steady load emerged briefly before fading again. None of it required attention. It was simply the ship continuing as she had begun. I extended the record into the evening hours, carrying forward the estimates already made. The course held, and the wind remained steady, though its pressure on the sails increased slightly as the air cooled. I noted the change and left the arrangement intact. The crew moved with quieter purpose as darkness gathered. Voices dropped without instruction, and tasks were carried out with less conversation. I observed this as part of the transition, rather than as a change in behavior. Night brings its own order. A meal was taken earlier than usual, the timing adjusted to match the light rather than the glass. The fare was simple and unremarkable, eaten quickly and without pause. I noted the shift only because it marked the first departure from daytime routine. As the night deepened, the wind freshened slightly, its presence announced by a sharper tone in the rigging. The vessel answered it without protest, though the motion beneath us grew more insistent. I adjusted the course by a small degree and allowed the change to stand. A brief squall passed through shortly after. It announced itself well in advance, the air cooling and the water's surface tightening before the first rain arrived. The crew made their adjustments without haste, each movement familiar and practiced. During the squall, I attended more closely to time and course, noting the intervals between each measure rather than relying on longer spans. The compass remained steady, and the vessel's response was consistent. There was no need for correction beyond what had already been made. The rain passed as it had come, without ceremony. The wind eased back to its earlier strength, and the vessel resumed her previous rhythm. I extended the estimates forward once more, satisfied that the interruption had not altered them in any meaningful way. The sound of water along the hull returned to its earlier pattern, broad and even. At times it pressed forward into awareness, at others it receded entirely, leaving only the sense of motion itself. A minor disagreement arose among the crew during the next watch change, brief and low in tone. It resolved itself without intervention, the matter forgotten as quickly as it had appeared. Such moments are inevitable when time stretches and tasks repeat. I noted the passage of another hour and continued the record. The work required no more than presence. Each measure followed the last without insistence. The air cooled further as the night progressed, though the change was gradual. The vessel's motion remained unchanged, and the course continued to hold. I observed the consistency and allowed it to continue. Food was taken again later than expected, more as a formality than a necessity. The routine shifted to accommodate the watches rather than the other way around. I noted the adaptation and moved on. Another band of unsettled weather passed nearby without crossing our path, its presence suggested only by a brief change in wind direction and a tightening of the water's surface. I adjusted nothing and allowed the vessel to proceed. As the night wore on, fatigue appeared quietly among the crew, visible more in posture than in performance. Tasks were completed more slowly, though no less accurately. I recorded the observation, without comment. The water beneath us carried the hull forward steadily, its motion unchanged by the hours that had passed. I confirmed the course once more and allowed the record to continue. The night settled into routine once again, its earlier interruptions absorbed into the broader pattern of motion and time. I remained with the work, attentive without strain, and allowed the hours to pass as they would. The night held steady after the earlier unsettled weather passed, its character unchanged by the hours that followed. The sky remained closed, offering no stars by which to measure progress. I noted the absence without concern. The course had been set, and the vessel continued as she had through the evening. The water beneath the hull carried a broad, even motion now, lifting and settling the ship without insistence. The sound along the planking was constant, neither rising nor falling in tone. I allowed it to remain in the background as the work of the watch drew to its close. The next measure of time arrived without distinction. I recorded it and completed the remaining notes for the night, extending the estimates forward with no alteration. There was nothing in the vessel's motion that suggested otherwise. With the record complete, I left the deck to the men who would remain through the night and made my way below. The transition was familiar, marked by a softening of sound and a narrowing of space. Below decks, the ship's movement felt closer, more personal, as though the hull itself carried the night inward. In my cabin the air was still. The faint motion of the ship reached the walls gently, enough to be felt but not enough to disturb. I set aside the instruments and allowed the day to settle behind me. I reviewed the hours that had passed, not in detail but in shape. The departure, the widening water, the brief unsettled weather, and the return to routine. Each had taken its place without requiring more than attention. There is comfort in days that require no explanation. I took up my journal once more, adding a final line to mark the close of the day. The words were brief and unadorned. They needed only to be sufficient. Afterward, I prepared a letter, one that would wait until we reached a port willing to receive it. I wrote knowing it would travel slowly, carried by hands and routes yet unknown. That knowledge did not trouble me. It suited the pace of the words. I wrote of the weather in general terms and of the vessel's steady progress. I mentioned the lengthening days and the cooler nights and how the sea had taken on a broader motion since we left the river behind. These were safe things to set down. I wrote also of home, though less directly. I noted small details remembered rather than events anticipated. The sound of footsteps in the morning, the way light settles in a room when the day is clear. These things return more readily at sea than one might expect. I did not write of distance. Distance speaks for itself. There were thoughts I did not commit to the page. Worries tend to lose their shape when left unwritten, and hopes require no record to remain present. I allowed those to pass without interruption. The ship continued on, her motion unchanged by my absence from the deck. I felt it through the narrow frame of the cabin, steady and unhurried. It was enough. I set the letter aside and secured the journal. The work of the day had concluded, and there was nothing more to add. What remained would carry itself until morning. I lay back and allowed the sound of the water to return, filtered now through wood and distance. The night held its course, and the vessel held hers. Tomorrow would come when it chose to. For now, the ship moved on, and that was sufficient. Morning arrived without ceremony. The light changed first, softening at the edges before brightening enough to mark the day's return. The sky remained closed, its cover unbroken, offering no direct sign of the sun's position. I noted the hour by habit rather than by sight and returned to the deck. The air carried the coolness of night still, though it was easing. The vessel moved as she had through the dark hours, her motion steady and unaltered by the change of watch. The water beneath us held its course, broad and even. I reviewed the work left from the night and carried it forward into the morning. The estimates held. There was no reason to disturb them. When the day begins without clear markers, continuity becomes its own reference. The crew stirred gradually, each man taking his place without instruction. Movements were slower at first, shaped by the lingering quiet rather than by fatigue. The ship's routine reasserted itself as the light strengthened. The sky showed no interest in clearing. I acknowledged this and turned my attention to the measures already in hand. A morning without a sun is not uncommon in these waters, and it asks only patience. I extended the course forward through the early hours, relying on the vessel's movement, the wind's consistency, and the passage of time. The method required no embellishment. It had carried us through the night and would continue to do so. The sound along the hull remained constant, its tone unchanged from the hours before. It blended with the low movement of the ship, forming a background that required no attention to interpret. A simple meal was taken on deck as the day settled in. The timing followed the watch rather than the clock, and the fare was unchanged from the night before. I observed the familiarity of it and returned to the work. There was a brief adjustment to the sails as the wind shifted slightly, more in angle than in strength. The vessel answered the change without delay, and the motion beneath us remained even. I recorded the adjustment and let it stand. The horizon remained indistinct, its line softened by the low cloud. Sea and the sky met without definition, offering no contrast by which to judge distance. I did not regard this as a hindrance. The work did not depend on clarity of view. I recalled earlier passages when the absence of a morning sight had unsettled me more than it should have. With time I learned that such absences are part of the pattern, not interruptions to it. The hours advanced quietly. Each was marked, noted and released without insistence. The vessel's course held, and the water beneath us carried her forward without variation. There was nothing in the arrangement of wind, sea, or motion that suggested change. I allowed the day to continue as it had begun, guided by routine rather than expectation. The sky remained closed as the morning wore on. I accepted this and carried the record forward once more, confident that the method in use required no immediate confirmation. The ship moved on, steady and unhurried, her progress measured not by sight, but by continuity. I remained with the work, attentive without strain, and let the morning settle into its familiar shape. The day continued much as the morning had begun, its shape defined more by repetition than by change. The sky remained closed, and the water carried the vessel forward with the same broad motion that had held since nightfall. I noted the consistency and allowed it to remain undisturbed. As the hours passed, I found myself recalling earlier voyages made closer to home, when the sea was narrower and the land more familiar. Those passages had followed their own routines, shaped by coastlines and ports known well enough to require little thought. The work then had been no less careful, though it had felt different in its familiarity. In the Mediterranean, mornings often announced themselves more clearly. Light sharpened sooner, and the sun made its presence known without hesitation. Here, the day arrived quietly, its markers softened by cloud and distance. I noted the contrast without preference. Each had its own order. I extended the record forward through the middle hours of the day, carrying the estimates with the same care I had used before. The figures required no adjustment. They rested easily alongside one another, supported by time rather than by sight. The vessel's motion remained unchanged, her progress steady and unremarkable. I observed the agreement between sea, wind, and course, and returned to the work without further thought. During quieter moments, memory tends to surface without invitation. I recalled mornings at home, when routine followed a different pattern, shaped less by watch and more by shared habit. Sundays marked by mass taken together, the familiar cadence of words heard often enough to require no effort to follow. At sea, such routines change, though they do not disappear entirely. I have learned to carry them inward, keeping what can be kept and setting aside what must wait. Faith, like navigation, endures best when practiced steadily, rather than displayed. There are moments during the day when I pause briefly, not for instruction, but for acknowledgement. The passage of time, the steadiness of the vessel, the order that persists even when sight is limited. These require no explanation, only recognition. I do not mark such moments in the log. They belong elsewhere. The crew continued their work without interruption, their movements shaped by repetition rather than urgency. The vessel answered them as she had since our departure, her motion unchanged by the hours that passed. I returned my attention to the measures at hand and carried them forward once more. The sky offered no new reference, and none was required. The method remained sound. As the day moved on, the light shifted subtly, its quality changing without altering the sky's uniform cover. I noted the passage and allowed it to stand. In earlier years, I might have sought meaning in such sameness. With time, I have come to understand that constancy does not require interpretation. It simply continues. The water beneath us carried the hull forward steadily, its motion unchanged. I remained with the work, attentive without strain, and allowed the day to settle into its familiar rhythm. The swell had settled into a steady pattern by the middle of the day, its rise and fall no longer changing in character but repeating itself with quiet insistence. The vessel answered it without hesitation, her movement now shaped more by the breadth of the sea than by any remaining influence of land. I observed the motion as I had since morning, not by sight alone, but by the way it carried through the hull. Each lift followed the last with little variation. It was the kind of regularity that invites trust. The sky remained closed, its cover unbroken and even. Light filtered through without direction, offering no clear reference. I noted the hour by habit and extended the record forward, carrying the estimates with it. The captain came on deck shortly after, his presence marked less by sound than by the way the crew adjusted themselves. Conversations ended without instruction. Movements became more deliberate. I continued my work as before. He stood near the rail for a time, observing the water ahead. When he spoke, it was to issue a brief correction to the course, delivered without emphasis. The change was small. The effect was immediate. I acknowledged the order and made the adjustment. The vessel answered it without complaint. The captain remained a moment longer, watching the result, then turned away without further comment. Order once established requires little maintenance. Later, when the deck had quieted again, he returned to my position and spoke more softly, his words intended only for me. He asked after the estimates and the condition of the swell. I answered plainly. He listened without interruption. For a moment the formality eased. He remarked that the sea had taken hold of us sooner than expected. I agreed. The exchange was brief, professional, and sufficient. When footsteps approached, the familiarity withdrew at once. He resumed his place as captain, and I returned to the record. The boundary between ranks reasserted itself without effort. The crew took their meal under his eye, the routine carried out efficiently and without delay. There was little conversation. Plates were cleared promptly. The watch resumed its shape. The swell continued unchanged through the afternoon, its regular motion now fully established. I extended the estimates again, carrying them forward with confidence born of repetition. The figures aligned with the vessel's movement and the time recorded. I noted the consistency and moved on. The sound along the hull deepened, its tone broadened by the water's regular rise and fall. It no longer varied enough to draw attention. Instead, it remained constant, a steady companion to the work. A minor correction was made to the set of the sails as the wind shifted slightly in angle. The captain observed the change, nodded once and said nothing further. The adjustment held. I have always found that the sea settles more easily when the ship's order is firm. Routine responds well to authority, when authority does not waver. As the hours passed, fatigue appeared quietly among the crew, visible more in posture than in performance. The captain noticed it before it became a concern. Watches were rotated with minimal instruction. The work continued. The sky offered no new reference. I did not seek one. Dead reckoning remained sufficient, supported by time, course, and the vessel's steady response to the swell. I extended the record once more, letting the repetition of the work carry it forward. The method did not require innovation. It required attention. The afternoon stretched on without interruption, the swell maintaining its regular rise and fall beneath the hull. Each motion followed the last, with little variation, enough to be felt clearly, but not enough to demand attention. The vessel moved as though the water itself had agreed to carry her forward at a measured pace. I remained with the record, extending it through the hours that followed. The estimates continued to support one another, not through precision, but through consistency. When time, course, and motion align for long enough, they require less supervision. The captain returned to the deck once more, his presence again altering the tone of the space without the need for instruction. He observed the set of the sails and the line of the horizon for several moments before speaking. A small adjustment was ordered, not in response to error, but to maintain the discipline of the course. The change was made at once. The vessel answered it without complaint. He remained until the effect was clear, then moved on, leaving the order intact behind him. Nothing else was said. Nothing else was required. The crew worked under that order with practiced familiarity. Tasks were completed efficiently, movements economical. Even conversation, when it occurred, remained brief and subdued. I noted the passage of another interval and extended the record forward again. The swell showed no sign of diminishing. Its regularity had become the defining feature of the day. In the hours that followed, the ship's routine settled deeper into itself. Watches rotated, meals were taken. The sound of water along the hull continued without variation, its presence now fully absorbed into the background of thought. I adjusted the record once more, not because the figures demanded it, but because the habit itself reinforces continuity. The act of writing carries time forward as surely as the vessel carries distance. The captain addressed the crew briefly near the change of watch, his words few and precise. There was no need to raise his voice. Order responded to expectation as readily as it did to command. When he spoke to me again, it was to confirm what had already been observed. The swell remained steady. The course held. The night would require no alteration to the arrangement already in place. We exchanged no further words. The understanding between officers does not require repetition. As the light began to soften toward evening, the sky showed no sign of breaking. The cloud cover remained unbroken, its tone deepening without revealing structure. I acknowledged the change in light and continued the work. The water beneath us carried the hull forward steadily, its motion unchanged by the hours already past. Fatigue appeared quietly among the crew, though it did not interfere with performance. The captain noticed it and adjusted the watch without comment. I extended the record again, letting the repetition of the work carry it forward. There was no need to seek variation where none was required. The swell continued through the later hours, its rhythm now fully familiar. The vessel answered it without hesitation, her movement disciplined and unhurried. As evening settled in, the captain made his final inspection of the deck. Satisfied, he left the watch in capable hands and withdrew below. The order he had set remained, unchanged by his absence. The crew continued their work as they had under his eye, the routine holding firm. I remained at my post, attentive but unstrained, and allowed the hours to pass as they would. The sea held its course. The ship held hers. Time advanced without insistence, marked only by repetition and motion. The captain returned briefly near evening, scanned the horizon, and gave a final instruction regarding the night watches. His voice carried no urgency. It did not need to. When he left the deck, the order he had set remained behind him. The crew continued, as they had under his eye, the rhythm unchanged. The swell held through the later hours, its motion now familiar enough to fade into the background. I remained with the work, attentive without strain, and allowed the sea to set the pace as it had all day. The vessel moved on, steady and disciplined, carried forward by water that had found its rhythm and a ship that had accepted it.